how compassion really can be the basis of thinking about a new world. And in order to do that, we need a science. What is the science of compassion? How does it work in the mind? How does it work in social relationships and so forth? And one of the things to highlight is that compassion is very interested in the big questions. It's interested in the nature of reality, the nature of mind. For those of you who are interested in the Buddhist approaches, the meditations are all about trying to understand the nature of our minds. And certainly within the Mahayana traditions, the key issue in the Buddhist position is the study of suffering and the alleviation of suffering. So, excuse me, one of the key things, and thinking about this talk with this dreadful situation happening at the moment, huge tragedy, is that, compassion is not naive about the challenges that face the human species. And this has been known for quite a while, that a mind that does not know itself has the potential to be dangerous, cruel, and actually quite crazy. And if you look at human history, certainly since the time of agriculture, it's very clear that humans can be one of the nastiest, most vicious, most sadistic species that have ever existed on this planet. And I think we have to begin from this position of understanding that we have a terrible dark side in terms of our tribalism, which is what we're seeing right now, but also the history of slavery and torture and so on. And the tragedy is, however, is that on the other side, we also have a fantastic potential for being one of the most compassionate, most mindful species that have ever walked this planet. So we are basically a multi-mind, we're a species of extremes, and we need to understand how we start oscillating between these extremes, because as I say, the last 5,000 years or whatever has seen nothing but tribal violence throughout the world, and we're seeing it again now with tragic consequences. Now, we also know that these different states of mind are linked to different brain systems, different physiologies, genes, and epigenetics. And so the key issue is, what do we cultivate in our minds, not only personally, but within our cultures, because cultures are also the context for how our minds work. And if we create contexts which feed the dark side, then we will get the dark side. But if we feed contexts that feed the compassionate side of our minds, then that is what will grow. So it's very important to understand that these are processes in the mind that can be cultivated. And so they are highly dependent on culture. Now, in the Buddhist position, of course, there's the training of the Eightfold Pathway, which I won't go into. And the other point is that we can also, for those of you who are interested in the mental health side of things, we also have a mind that can be at war with itself. We can be very self-critical. We can ruminate on all of the bad things. We can engage in amplification and catastrophization. But again, we also have a mind that can be full of courage and engagement and self-support and so on and so on. And so the question then is, once again, is thinking of the mind as a multi-mind with all of these different potentials. And the question is, what do we cultivate and how do we cultivate it? Now, the idea that the mind is full of potential dark side has been known for a long, long time. Of course, centuries-old recognitions of the poisons of the mind. That's one of the Buddhist positions. And the whole point of cultivating one's mind with mindfulness and with compassion is to address the issue that within us are these different potentials. And there's really quite a good book which is based on evolutionary science. Robert White is an evolutionary theorist, but he uses evolutionary theory to highlight the fact that a lot of what the Buddhists have been saying for thousands of years in terms of the nature of the mind and what we need to do to cultivate the good is pretty much true. So what are the major challenges? Well, the major challenges we're up against is one of the challenges we have what we call the fragmentation of science. And we are a species that likes to create tribes. So for those of you who are interested in psychotherapy, it's actually become ridiculous now. We've got something like 400 different schools of psychotherapy. And if we look at the ways in which we've thought about the mind, we have people studying the biology, people studying the sociology. We have people who, want to treat mental health problems with drugs, and other people want to have social change. And this is partly because the sciences are very fragmented. But one of the key issues then that I think all of us need to address as a species, and so on, is how do we understand the nature of suffering? How do we understand its causes, and how do we understand its alleviation? because the suffering is at the core of our human experience. We come into the world, we only last for about 30,000 days, and then we're finished, aren't we? And along the way, we'll have all kinds of hardships and difficulties and tragedies to face. So again, it's a Buddhist position, but actually life has many wonderful things, but there's also a lot of tragedies. So one of the key things is to recognize then that part of the causes of suffering can be actually in terms of both social and non-social, psychosocial and social causes. So there can be things like, obviously, like floods and so on. But a lot of suffering is also caused by our own behavior. And this is linked to three basic dimensions. One is that we just do it unintentionally. We don't know we're causing harm, like climate change. 100 years ago, people didn't know that they were causing climate change. So ignorance is a key issue. So that requires us to develop wisdom to understand the causes of suffering. But a second one is callousness. Well, we may understand it, but we actually don't care. We're not that bothered about it. So in the case of fossil fuels, for example, of course, we know that fossil fuels are feeding climate change, but I'm afraid there are a few individuals who don't actually care as long as they're making money and so on. We have known for a long time that tobacco smoking causes cancer, but those who produce cigarettes don't actually care. They're not cruel. In other words, they don't intend to cause suffering. They just don't care. So that's a big issue, that we can be quite callous. We can be indifferent to the suffering that we cause through pursuing our own self-interest. And then, of course, the third one is where we have a deliberate wish to cause suffering. And this can be a form of cruelty. And we see this in things like vengeance and so on, where causing suffering is the aim of the behavior. So these are three key things. And if you look at the history of look at our history, unfortunately, look at our tortures and our ways we would crucify people and the Roman games, we do have a cruel streak. And some of our entertainments, unfortunately, have really become quite sadistic and cruel in the last 50 years. So what can we do? Well, there are a couple of things. Again, this is basic psychology, but also in the Buddhist position, there are two things. Firstly, to become aware of our minds so that we're not ignorant about our minds. We become aware of what's going on in our minds so we can begin to make decisions about it. And those decisions should be guided by compassionate motivation. In other words, the desire not to cause suffering, the desire to prevent suffering and not cause it. And that can require us to cultivate our minds. We need to cultivate our minds. So that is a cultivation. Whoops, sorry, that's the process of cultivation is very, very important. So mind awareness, allied with the motivation and cultivating both, are really at the heart of what compassion-focused approaches are about. So in order for us to move on with that, then let's just start with a basic understanding of the mind, because the first thing we have to address is ignorance, that we don't understand. We just don't realize what we're doing. We don't really understand what's going on in our minds and what's happening. It should come up first. So the key thing is then understanding how we came into existence. So we are part of the flows of life, right? We come into existence, we go out, and along the way we have joys and so forth, and tragedies and so forth. But what's also important is to understand that we are genetically created beings, and we are orientated towards survival and reproduction. Those are our two big things. And a lot of our basic motivations and emotions really have evolved to serve those purposes. And we'll have a look at that in a moment. We also need to be aware that even though we are biologically created beings, like all other life forms, we have a social self. In other words, if I had been kidnapped as a 3-day-old baby into a violent drug gang, this version of Paul Gilbert wouldn't exist, because my whole being would be quite different. My genes would be different. My whole sense of self would be different. So we need to understand ourselves not just as a mind, but as a biopsychosocial mind, a biopsychosocial being, which means that we have a biological reality, we have a body, we have a brain, we have a psychological reality, but we also have a social constructed reality, and our versions of ourselves are partly related to our social embedded relationships. In terms of the genes, we're all basically part of a genetic lottery. Depending on when your parents made love, you wouldn't be here if they'd chosen another day, at least not quite as you, because the genetic combinations would have been quite different. So it's all a bit of an accident here. And this is DNA, and we know that DNA carries the information from building bodies, minds, to carry them around. Now, when we're working with our clients, we talk about this a little bit, in the sense we say that, you know, your brain and your body was built for you, not by you. We often say to people, you know, how many chose to have 2 arms and 2 legs? How many chose to be a male or a female? How many chose to be in one ethnicity or another? Excuse me. So, and of course, we didn't choose any of it. We've just been built. We just find ourselves consciousness in this built body. And genes are interested in their own survival, not in ours, I'm afraid. So bodies are short-lived, subject to diseases and injury, decay and die. That's the tragedy of it. And both psychological and physiological pain really are to indicate injury or problems of malfunction or problems. So the pain systems and the distress systems are all to indicate something is wrong and you need to do something about it. So anxiety, for example, is a signal that there's a threat out there, we need to do something about it. What's also very interesting is that we now know that we have these like triggers on the genes, and these genes can be turned on and off by experiences. Now, you can't change your genes, but you can change the genes that get turned on and off. And this is very important because this is what gives rise to what we call phenotypes. Excuse me. And that is important because what it means is that basically children who are growing up in very damaging, abusive backgrounds, they're having those backgrounds are having epigenetic effects. They're not only changing or affecting the way the brain grows, but they're actually also changing what genes get turned on and off in us. Now, this is very, very important because if you look at the history of humanity, right, over the last 10,000 years, the context we have created have not done any favors to our epigenetics, really. We've been living in environments that have often been at war, okay, from the you know, the Middle Eastern countries all the way through the Romans and the Egyptians and the Vikings and so on and so on. So we've created these very high threat contexts for thousands of years where we have been growing and our children are growing, and all the peacemakers of the farmers, well, they just got slaughtered. So we've been wiping out all those genes as well. So we've got quite an issue on our hands about the importance of the environments we create in which our children grow have a fundamental impact on the kinds of epigenetic processes that they will be engaged with. And as there's a lot of evidence now that these influences in childhood, particularly whether children are cared for or not cared for, can have long-term implications and even be passed. Epigenetic changes can actually be passed through the generations. So when we think about compassion, when we think about caring, it's fundamental. It's fundamental to the kind of beings we become. And this is very important. Otherwise, if you just get, you know, compassion is a bit about being loved, let's have some love and let's be kind to each other. I mean, I'm all in favor of love, but compassion is a lot more than just let's be kind to each other. It's fundamental to the kinds of brains and bodies we have. The other important point is to get across is that we are socially embedded beings and we co-regulate each other. And so if I'm kind to you, supporting you, then that has an impact on your brain, and then you will hopefully be kind to me. Whereas if I'm critical of you and I keep arguing with you and putting you down, that's going to keep stimulating your stress system. In other words, brains are deeply embedded within the social fabric of their lives. Very important. So we need then to try to understand our minds, because that's the great challenge of humanity, okay? Because if we don't, if we get caught up in ignorance, then that's a deep problem. And really the ways in which we understand our minds now and the profound power of compassion, this has really come out of research, I think. Excuse me. So let me just give a quick overview of how we can understand our minds. We have 4 basic dimensions of mind. One of the motives, and there are three basic life motives here. All living things have to have ways of detecting harm and dealing with it. They have to be able to acquire resources for eating and mates and so forth, but they also have to be able to rest and digest. They can't just be charging around avoiding threats and seeking resources all the time. So these are your three basic life tasks. And these will give rise to emotions, excuse me. And now emotions are different to motives because emotions come on and go off. They are short-lived changes in physiological state that allow you to take actions, they'll redirect your attention and so forth. So when there is, for example, harm, these systems detect a threat, these anxiety or anger will come on in order to then control the animal or control us to engage in reducing the threat. The third dimension really is competencies. Now, competencies are your abilities to perform functions. So, birds need wings to fly, but they also need a brain to navigate them in the air. Those two things go together. Now, humans, one of the extraordinary evolutionary processes over the last 2, possibly less million years has been our cognitive, the evolution of the frontal cortex and other processes. We have the most extraordinary change in cognitive abilities. We are able to reason and problem solve. We can understand the nature of our behavior. We can realize that something I do today could affect me in 10 years' time. We also have a capacity for what we call mentalizing or empathy. Again, quite an extraordinary capacity to be able to read the minds of others in deep ways. And we also have a capacity for what we call being conscious of being conscious. And that is what gives us a rise to awareness, forms of awareness, which is the basis for mindfulness. I can observe my mind, I can think about my mind, I can begin to make sense of what's going on in my mind because I can observe it. And through all of these processes, I can have what is called knowing intentionality. Now, knowing intentionality is a game changer. So if you think about this, lions will certainly want to hunt and kill prey. They have intentions, no question. They have drives, they have motives, they do want to do that. But they can't do that knowingly. They can't suddenly decide, you know what, all of this hunting and killing animals is very cruel, I don't think I want to do that anymore. I'm going to become a vegetarian, They can't wake up in the morning and think, you know what, I need to train because I'm getting overweight. I'm just not fast anymore. They can't have those kinds of insights. They can't start to change their behavior according to their chosen intention, but we can. And that's very important because a chosen intention can really change the way in which our minds work. And then, of course, we have outputs, which are your behaviors. And we know that actually engaging in behaviors can also change the mind. It doesn't matter how much you know about driving, how much you read about it, how much you watched other people, you'll only get good at it if you drive yourself. So these are, certainly in therapy terms, you're going to be wanting to operate in all of these 4 domains. Sometimes you're working with people's motives, sometimes their emotions, sometimes their competencies, sometimes their behaviors, and so on. And so basically what we're trying to do therapeutically, but also in terms of just in general, is helping people to understand the basis of their minds, that their minds are full of desires and motives and wants and needs. They're full of the capacities for experiencing emotions. They're able to think and to reason and to become mindful, and they're able to behave. And when we do that, the idea is that we are then increasing people's sense of awareness. People can become more aware of what's going on in their minds. They'll be able to differentiate different functions. Oh, this is this motive, this is my emotion, this is my desire, this is my memory. They can become tolerant of difficult emotions and difficult desires. They can begin to integrate those, transform them, and that leads to adaptation. Some people call it flexibility, we call it adaptation. The individuals become much more able to adapt helpfully to whatever context that they are operating in. So, and then on the other side, when we become more aware, when we become more differentiated, we can then begin to choose to live our lives to be self-supportive, self-reassuring, and self-encouraging, and so forth. Because we have intentionality, because we have knowing intentionality, we can choose these motives. Now, when we come to compassion, then let's take it back to a root, because again, there's a lot of not very helpful things about compassion on the internet. It's about loving and all that. Love is great. I'm all in favor of it, but it has a very different evolutionary history to compassion. Compassion is rooted in caring. So let's have a look then, because an algorithm is simply an if A, then do B. So if a predator, then run away and hide, there we are. But if the stimulus is food, then of course what you want to do is to eat. You don't want to run away if it's food. So what an algorithm needs is a feature detector, something that will detect this stimulus and then trigger a response, okay? So in the case of sexuality, if the stimulus is a sexual indicator, then that will trigger courting behavior. At this time of the year, all my pigeons are starting to attract the females, the male pigeons, so they clap their wings like this. Well, I've tried it with my wife, it doesn't work. And that's because she doesn't have feature detectors for that behavior, see, so that's no good. And this is the one we're interested in, of course, which is if an infant is distressed and needing to, then the parent jumps in to alleviate. So you need to have feature detectors for distress. Now, for the most part, reptiles don't, but mammals certainly do. And that algorithm is really the central aspect of what compassion is, because compassion, excuse me, is this sensitivity to suffering with a commitment to do something about it. Now, it evolved partly, but not completely. There were other reasons for compassion out of caring behavior. So we know that these poor little chappies, they don't have anybody to care for them when they're born. They have to go it alone. And so the ways in which reproduction occurs for these species is you just create hundreds and hundreds, sometimes thousands, and only a few of them will survive to adulthood. So that's a pretty, nature is pretty harsh, okay? It's a pretty harsh thing. But then begins protection. So this is a crocodile who hears the cries of the baby from the nest, and her hatchling, I should say, and then will carry it to the water. Won't do anything else, just that one act to carry the infant to the water, and that protects it from predation as it breaks through the nest. But then as we go on through evolution, investment, the caring, what we do in caring becomes much more complicated, increasingly complicated. Caring behavior has multiple functions, not just protection, that's important, but multiple functions of looking after and play and engagement and so on and so on. And so we can see then that the nature of caring behavior comes with these issues of awareness and motivation and understanding the need to be caring and how you express caring behavior. And this is fundamental because basically our offspring simply don't survive unless they get it. This is one of the most fundamental inputs of for the young, of course. And we know then that when it comes to caring, caring is not one thing. And we're going to see that compassion is not one thing. Caring can require many different kinds of activity, protecting, feeding, temperature regulation. So you need appropriate actions. What that means is then that animals have to be able to distinguish what is needed, what is the issue, and match that with an appropriate behavior. And animals can do that. So if A, then B, that's the basis of infant caring. And that actually is the archetypal nature of compassion and caring behavior. So here we go. Then we can now define compassion because we've laid it out from an evolutionary algorithm approach. And this matches up with the Buddhist position that compassion is a sensitivity to suffering in self and others with a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent it. Now, not all definitions have that, but we think that's an incredibly important aspect of the definition. And that means that you then have this stimulus detection, this ability to engage. And we know that some individuals struggle to do that. They dissociate, they deny, they're not interested, they become callous. I'm not interested in your suffering, I don't care about it. And so the issue about how we help people become sensitive and responsive and be moved by suffering, that in itself, be it in you or be it in others, is a very important issue. And in schools now, compassion training is teaching children to be empathically aware, to be much more empathically aware of the impact their behavior has on other people, to be more empathically aware of the needs of people. So we're training children to become stimulus sensitive, to become aware of the needs of other people, to become aware of what other people are feeling, what other people are needing. And sometimes that takes a lot of courage to do that, of course. Sometimes if we're working with our own needs, maybe it's trauma memory, then we're going to have to develop courage. And then the second aspect of an algorithm, always remember you've got these two algorithms. So once you've got an algorithm, you've got the stimulus detection, you've got to work on that, okay, that's important. And then so what do you do? So the next thing is then the working on the psychology of alleviation. So what is it that you do? How do we prevent suffering and so on? Because, if I see somebody fall into a river and I say, oh, I'm a surgeon, and I decide to jump in and can't swim, or I've got my Wellington boots on and sink, that's not very helpful. So the aspect of stimulus detection and the engagement with courage, having courage to engage with suffering, that's great. But without wisdom, it can be reckless. On the other hand, having wisdom but no courage can be ineffective. So courage and wisdom are really central to this algorithm. And once we understand that, that's really quite key. And that's why when you see it from an algorithm point of view, you realize that all this stuff about love and blah, blah, that's irrelevant. And actually that gets in the way. When you actually focus on compassion as this very clear algorithm, and we can actually map it in the brain, we can actually study it in the brain, and at the core of it is this capacity for courage to engage with suffering, and then the determination to generate the wisdom of how to alleviate it. Now we're into serious business. And if you think about the vaccines, for example, that came from dedicated wisdom of those scientists to produce vaccines. And not only that, but all the dedication of the volunteers who tested the vaccine. So, this courage wisdom thing is something that we push a lot. Now, the other point is that this is very close to the Buddhist position, because the Buddhist position is the desire, the wish, may all be free of suffering or the causes of suffering. And so that produces that takes us back to prevention, because if you're going to address the causes of suffering, then you're going to have to prevent it. And in terms of the world that's going on right now, these problems, according to some historians, were very preventable after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when Gorbachev was in power, and we really didn't do enough to ensure that the Russian economy and political systems were engaged. We were kind of disengaged from them. We thought that the Russians were finished. We didn't need to bother with them anymore, and that's all plotted in history. So our preventative actions were pretty poor after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So so I must move on quickly. So I just want to make clear that therefore, compassion is a basic algorithm from our point of view. And the other point is that compassion is not a benzo. This is a really excellent paper by, just keep my eye on the time here, just a couple more minutes perhaps. Let's just see where I am. Okay. The other thing is to realize that compassion is not a benzo, really. This is a wonderful paper by Nico Petrocchi and his colleagues. And again, this is something that's often misunderstood. Different people can be really good at different aspects of compassion. So here's a firefighter. You can ask, well, what would he be feeling? Or she, it could be a she, what would he or she be feeling? Well, they're not going to be in a calm state of mind, are they? They're going to be in an anxious state of mind. They're going to be highly vigilant to the fire. They're going to be determined. They'll have to show courage, but they also need a lot of wisdom. They know how to do that, right? And this idea that somehow compassion, you have to have a calm mind and all of that. No, you don't. It depends upon the context in which you're being compassionate. Compassion is simply sensitivity to suffering and trying to do something about it, right? Wisely. That's what it is. Now, in this case, you're not going to have a calm mind, but you do need to be in control of your mind. This is Martin Luther King. Now, his compassion, of course, is orientated in a completely different way. This is to fight social injustice and so on and so on. And here is a counselor counseling somebody who's maybe dying, and their compassion is different again. So, when you take that basic algorithm, what you can see is that what compassion is and the kinds of emotions that it will stir up in us, the kind of wisdoms that we're going to need, really depend upon the context. And some people can be very good at one, but not any good at the other. So, for example, a firefighter, you may risk their lives to save you, and they may be brilliant firefighters, but they might not make empathic parents, for example, or very empathic parents may be wonderful, but they might not make very good firefighters, or they might not make very good orators like Martin Luther King. So when you're working clinically, and I know this isn't particularly clinical talk, but when you're working clinically, find the compassion area in your client and build from what they can do outwards, really. The other thing is that Paul Ekman and people like him have highlighted the importance of the concept of heroic compassion. And Philip Zimbardo has also got this program, which I would strongly support, which I do strongly support, called the Heroic Imagination Project. And again, it's coming back to this whole issue that, compassion is not this soft, gentle, let's be tender, all that stuff that you get in some of the models. It can be tender, of course it can be, but the main thing about compassion is courage and wisdom to address suffering. Courage and wisdom to address suffering. That is the underlying all the time, and don't get caught up with some of the other things. That's what we would argue. And that means then that we can identify the motive, we can identify the emotions. The emotions depend upon the context. If we do help somebody and we relieve their suffering, then that gives us joy. If on the other hand, we don't help them and we let them down, we can feel guilt. And those are the behaviors. So you can look at these sort of things. Now, I better begin to wrap up now very quickly, as I know I'm running out of time. The other thing I want to say is that, look, these processes, compassion is an algorithm which is ancient, millions of years old, and along the way of evolving, there's a capacity to have these feature detectors for suffering to be sensitive to it and to be able to take action. That has been building physiological systems in the body and the brain. So, for example, oxytocin is a hormone that's very important in caring and receiving care. The vagus nerve is very, very important. And now we can actually develop trainings to go after that. So I'm going to now jump to a slide which just say this slide very quickly. This slide is really just highlight the fact that motivations organize your mind, right? Beliefs are important and emotions are important, of course they are, but what's really important is how a motive, what your motivation, your intention will really organize you. So if you're going out tonight and you're going to see your lover, that's very different than if you're going to get help from a doctor, or if you are the doctor and you are giving help. So what you're motivated to do will have an impact on your brain states, what you pay attention to, how you're reasoning, how you plan. Okay, so I'm just going to touch on these and then we can come to an end. So we now know then that there are a whole array of ways in which we can cultivate the compassionate mind. We can cultivate a compassionate brain. We understand its evolution. We understand its basic algorithm. We understand something about its physiology, and we can understand something about how we train it. For example, we can use the body to support the mind. How do you do that? Well, there are postures, there are breathing exercises that stimulate the vagus, that stimulate the frontal cortex. Yoga, acupuncture, we now know that diet can have an impact on the vagus. There's what we call mind-body awareness, where we can learn mindfulness. We can activate compassion through practicing. We can practice things that are compassion focused. So, for example, a firefighter may practice rescuing people, a doctor may practice surgery, we may practice working with our minds, meditating and becoming familiar with our minds. There are ways in which we can cultivate compassion qualities by thinking about, if I was to be at my most compassionate today, what would I be like? What qualities would I have? If I was to be at my most compassionate to deal with my anxiety or depression, what would that be like? And there are a whole range in compassion focused therapy of developing these insights, these ideas about what a compassionate self is. We can use imagery. Imagery is extremely important, and we help clients understand that what you imagine affects your brain. So, for example, if you're very hungry and you see a meal, that will stimulate your hypothalamus, but you could just fantasize a meal, and that would do the same. If your lover undresses in front of you, that will stimulate your pituitary and get you aroused. But you could also just imagine having a sexual encounter, and that will do the same. So what you imagine stimulates physiological systems. Now, if you're critical, that will stimulate your threat system. But if you practice imagining compassionate interactions, okay, and we know this because there have been in brain studies, if you imagine compassionate interactions, imagine receiving compassion, imagine giving compassion, that stimulates pathways in your brain. And we know that over time, because of neuroplasticity, you can actually produce changes in the brain. There have been studies looking at loving kindness, for example, and how that changes the brain. Okay, so that's basically what I want to say. There's some slides there that you can have a look at. So the key thing really, just to show you this last little bit, is that what we need to do, because I like this last little bit, whoops, and what we need to do is to begin to help all of us understand what compassion is, because there's an awful lot out on the internet that's not terribly helpful. Compassion is a dedication, it's a courageous wisdom to address suffering. And if we take this, we have an opportunity to really spread that around the world.